The last scene, Aaron's Buildings, Chapter 3, of No Name. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bob Neufeld. No Name by Wilkie Collins. The last scene, Aaron's Buildings, Chapter 3. Magdalen's first glance round the empty room showed her the letter on the table. The address, as the doctor had predicted, broke the news the moment she looked at it. Not a word escaped her. She sat down by the table, pale and silent, with the letter in her lap. Twice she attempted to open it, and twice she put it back again. The bygone time was not alone in her mind as she looked at her sister's handwriting. The fear of Kirk was there with it. "My past life," she thought. "What will he think of me when he knows my past life?" She made another effort, and broke the seal. A second letter dropped out of the enclosure, addressed to her in a handwriting with which she was not familiar. She put the second letter aside, and read the lines which Norah had written. Ventnor, Isle of Wight, August 24th. My dearest Magdalen, when you read this letter, try to think that we have only been parted since yesterday, and dismiss from your mind, as I have dismissed from mine, the past and all that belongs to it. I am strictly forbidden to agitate you, to weary you by writing a long letter. Is it wrong to tell you that I am the happiest woman living? I hope not, for I can't keep the secret to myself. My darling, prepare yourself for the greatest surprise I have ever caused you. I am married. It is only a week today since I parted with my old name. It is only a week since I have been the happy wife of George Bartram, of St. Crux. There were difficulties at first in the way of our marriage. Some of them I am afraid of my making. Happily for me, my husband knew from the beginning that I really loved him. He gave me a second chance of telling him so, after I had lost the first, and, as you see, I was wise enough to take it. You ought to be especially interested, my love, in this marriage, for you are the cause of it. If I had not gone to Aldborough to search for the lost trace of you, if George had not been brought there at the same time by circumstances in which you were concerned, my husband and I might never have met. When we look back to our first impressions of each other, we look back to you. I must keep my promise not to weary you. I must bring this letter, sorely against my will, to an end. Patience, patience. I shall see you soon. George and I are both coming to London to take you back with us to Ventnor. This is my husband's invitation, mind, as well as mine. Don't suppose I married him, Magdalen, until I had taught him to think of you as I think, to wish with my wishes, and to hope with my hopes. I could say so much more about this, so much more about George, if I might only give my thoughts and my pen their own way, but I must leave Miss Garth, at her own special request, a blank space to fill up on the last page of this letter, and I must only add one word more before I say good-bye, a word to warn you that I have another surprise in store, which I am keeping in reserve until we meet. Don't attempt to guess what it is. You might guess for ages and be no nearer than you are now to the discovery of the truth. Your affectionate sister, Norah Bartram. Added by Miss Garth. My dear child, if I had ever lost my old loving recollection of you, I should feel it in my heart again now, when I know that it has pleased God to restore you to us from the brink of the grave. I add these lines to your sister's letter, because I am not sure that you are quite so fit yet, as she thinks you, to accept her proposal. She has not said a word of her husband or herself which is not true, but Mr. Bartram is a stranger to you, and if you think you can recover more easily and more pleasantly to yourself under the wing of your old governess than under the protection of your new brother-in-law, come to me first, and trust to my reconciling Norah to the change of plans. I have secured the refusal of a little college at Shanklin, near enough to your sister to allow your seeing each other whenever you like, and far enough away, at the same time, to secure you the privilege, when you wish it, of being alone. Send me one line before we meet to say yes or no, and I will write to Shanklin by the next post. Always yours affectionately, Harriet Garth. The letter dropped from Magdalen's hand. Thoughts which had never risen in her mind yet rose in it now. Norah, whose courage under undeserved calamity had been the courage of resignation, Norah, who had patiently accepted her hard lot, who from first to last had meditated no vengeance and stooped to no deceit, Norah had reached the end which all her sister's ingenuity, all her sister's resolution, and all her sister's daring had failed to achieve. Openly and honorably, with love on one side and love on the other, Norah had married the man who possessed the Combe-Raven money, and Magdalen's own scheme to recover it had opened the way to the event which had brought husband and wife together. As the light of that overwhelming discovery broke on her mind, the old strife was renewed, and good and evil struggled once more which should win her. But with added forces this time, with the new spirit that had been breathed into her new life, with the nobler sense that had grown with the growth of her gratitude to the man who had saved her, fighting on the better side. All the higher impulses of her nature, which had never, from first to last, let her err with impunity, which had tortured her, before her marriage and after it, with the remorse that no woman inherently heartless and inherently wicked can feel, all the nobler elements in her character gathered their forces for the crowning struggle, and strengthened her to meet, with no unworthy shrinking, the revelation that had opened on her view. Clearer and clearer, in the light of its immortal life, the truth rose before her from the ashes of her dead passions. When she looked at the letter again, when she read the words once more which told her that the recovery of the lost fortune was her sister's triumph, not hers, she had victoriously trampled down all little jealousies and all mean regrets. She could say in her heart of hearts, "Norah has deserved it." The day wore on. She sat absorbed in her own thoughts, and heedless of the second letter which she had not opened yet, until Kirke's return. He stopped on the landing outside, and opening the door a little way only, asked, without entering the room, if she wanted anything that he could send her. She begged him to come in. His face was worn and weary. He looked older than she had seen him look yet. "Did you put my letter on the table for me?" she asked. "Yes, I put it there at the doctor's request." "I suppose the doctor told you that it was from my sister?" "She is coming to see me, and Miss Garth is coming to see me. They will thank you for all your goodness to me better than I can." "I have no claim on their thanks," he answered, sternly. "What I have done was not done for them, but for you." He waited a little, and looked at her. His face would have betrayed him in that look, his voice would have betrayed him in the next words he spoke, if she had not guessed the truth already. "When your friends come here," he resumed, "they will take you away, I suppose, to some better place than this?" "They can take me to no place," she said gently, "which I shall think of as I think of the place where you found me. They can take me to no dearer friend than the friend who saved my life." There was a moment's silence between them. "We have been very happy here," he went on, in lower and lower tones. "You won't forget me when we have said good-bye?" She turned pale as the words passed his lips, and, leaving her chair, knelt down at the table, so as to look up into his face, and to force him to look into hers. "Why do you talk of it?" she asked. "We are not going to say good-bye, at least not yet." "I thought—" he began. "Yes? I thought your friends were coming here—" She eagerly interrupted him. "Do you think I would go away with anybody?" she said. "Even with the dearest relation I have in the world, and leave you here, not knowing and not caring whether ever I saw you again? Oh, you don't think that of me!" she exclaimed, with the passionate tears springing into her eyes. "I'm sure you don't think that of me." "No," he said. "I have never thought, I never can think, unjustly or unworthily of you." Before he could add another word she left the table as suddenly as she had approached it, and returned to her chair. He had unconsciously replied in terms that reminded her of the hard necessity which still remained unfulfilled, the necessity of telling him the story of the past. Not an idea of concealing that story from his knowledge crossed her mind. Will he love me when he knows the truth, as he loves me now? That was her only thought, as she tried to approach the subject in his presence without shrinking from it. "Let us put my own feelings out of the question," she said. "There is a reason for my not going away, unless I first have the assurance of seeing you again. You have a claim, the strongest claim of anyone, to know how I came here, unknown to my friends, and how it was that you found me fallen so low." "I make no claim," he said hastily. "I wish to know nothing which distresses you to tell me." "You have always done your duty," she rejoined with a faint smile. "Let me take example from you, if I can, and try to do mine." "I am old enough to be your father," he said bitterly. "Duty is more easily done at my age than it is at yours." His age was so constantly in his mind that he fancied it must be in her mind too. She had never given it a thought. The reference he just made to it did not divert her for a moment from the subject on which she was speaking to him. "You don't know how I value your good opinion of me," she said, struggling resolutely to sustain her sinking courage. "How can I deserve your kindness? How can I feel that I am worthy of your regard, until I have opened my heart to you? Oh, don't encourage me in my miserable weakness. Help me to tell the truth, force me to tell it, for my own sake, if not for yours." He was deeply moved by the fervent sincerity of that appeal. "You shall tell it," he said. "You are right, and I was wrong." He waited a little and considered. "Would it be easier to you," he asked, with delicate consideration for her, "to write it than to tell it?" She caught gratefully at the suggestion. "Far easier," she replied. "I can be sure of myself. I can be sure of hiding nothing from you, if I write it. Don't write to me on your side," she added, suddenly, seeing with a woman's instinctive quickness of penetration the danger of totally renouncing her personal influence over him. "Wait till we meet, and tell me with your own lips what you think." "Where shall I tell it?" "Here," she said eagerly. "Here, where you found me helpless. Here, where you have brought me back to life, and where I first learned to know you. I can bear the hardest words you say to me, if you will only say them in this room. It is impossible I can be away longer than a month. A month will be enough, and more than enough. If I come back—" She stopped confusedly. "I am thinking of myself," she said, "when I ought to be thinking of you. You have your own occupations and your own friends. Will you decide for us? Will you say how it shall be? It shall be as you wish. If you come back in a month, you will find me here." "Will it cause you no sacrifice of your own comfort and your own plans?" "It will cause me nothing," he replied, "but a journey back to the city." He rose and took his hat. "I must go there at once," he added, "or I shall not be in time." "It is a promise between us?" she said, and held out her hand. "Yes," he answered, a little sadly. "It is a promise." Slight as it was, the shade of melancholy in his manner pained her. Forgetting all other anxieties in the anxiety to cheer him, she gently pressed the hand he gave her. "If that won't tell him the truth," she thought, "nothing will." It failed to tell him the truth, but it forced a question on his mind which he had not ventured to ask himself before. "Is it her gratitude or her love that is speaking to me?" he wondered. If I was only a younger man, I might also hope it was her love." That terrible sum in subtraction which had first presented itself on the day when she told him her age began to trouble him again as he left the house. He took 20 from 41 at intervals, all the way back to the shipowner's office in Cornhill. Left by herself, Magdalen approached the table to write the line of answer which Miss Garth requested, and gratefully to accept the proposal that had been made to her. The second letter, which she had laid aside and forgotten, was the first object that caught her eye on changing her place. She opened it immediately, and, not recognizing the handwriting, looked at the signature. To her unutterable astonishment, her correspondent proved to be no less a person than old Mr. Clare. The philosopher's letter dispensed with all the ordinary forms of address, and entered on the subject without prefatory phrases of any kind, in these uncompromising terms: "I have more news for you of that contemptible cur, my son. Here it is in the fewest possible words. I have always told you, if you remember, that Frank was a sneak. The very first trace recovered of him, after his running away from his employers in China, presents him in that character. Where do you think he turns up next? He turns up, hidden behind a couple of flour barrels, on board an English vessel, bound homeward from Hong Kong to London. The name of the ship was the Deliverance, and the commander was one Captain Kirk. Instead of acting like a sensible man and throwing Frank overboard, Captain Kirk was fool enough to listen to his story. He made the most of his misfortunes, you may be sure. He was half-starved. He was an Englishman lost in a strange country without a friend to help him. His only chance of getting home was to sneak into the hold of an English vessel, and he had sneaked in, accordingly, at Hong Kong 2 days since. That was his story. Any other lout in Frank's situation would have been rope's-ended by any other captain. Deserving no pity from anybody, Frank was, as a matter of course, coddled and compassioned on the spot. The captain took him by the hand, the crew pitied him, and the passengers patted him on the back. He was fed, clothed, and presented with his passage home. Luck enough, so far, you will say. Nothing of the sort. Nothing like luck enough for my despicable son. The ship touched at the Cape of Good Hope. Among his other acts of folly, Captain Kirk took a woman passenger on board at that place. Not a young woman by any means. The elderly widow of a rich colonist. Is it necessary to say that she forthwith became deeply interested in Frank and his misfortunes? Is it necessary to tell you what followed? Look back at my son's career, and you will see that what followed was all of a piece with what went before. He didn't deserve your poor father's interest in him, and he got it. He didn't deserve your attachment, and he got it. He didn't deserve the best place in one of the best offices in London. He didn't deserve an equally good chance in one of the best mercantile houses in China. He didn't deserve food, clothing, pity, and a free passage home, and he got them all. Last, not least, he didn't even deserve to marry a woman old enough to be his grandmother, and he has done it. Not 5 minutes since I sent his wedding cards out to the dust-hole, and tossed the letter that came with them into the fire. The last piece of information which that letter contains is that he and his wife are looking out for a house and estate to suit them. Mark my words, Frank will get one of the best estates in England. A seat in the House of Commons will follow as a matter of course, and one of the legislators of this ass-ridden country will be my lout. If you are the sensible girl I have always taken you for, you have long since learned to rate Frank at his true value, and the news I send you will only confirm your contempt for him. I wish your poor father could but have lived to see this day. Often as I have missed my old gossip, I don't know that I have ever felt the loss of him so keenly as I felt it when Frank's wedding cards and Frank's letter came to this house. Your friend, if you ever want one, Francis Clare, Senior. With one momentary disturbance of her composure, produced by the appearance of Kirke's name in Mr. Clare's singular narrative, Magdalen read the letter steadily through from beginning to end. The time when it could have distressed her was gone by. The scales had long since fallen from her eyes. Mr. Clare himself would have been satisfied if he had seen the quiet contempt on her face as she laid aside his letter. The only serious thought it cost her was the thought in which Kirke was concerned. The careless manner in which he had referred in her presence to the passengers on board his ship, without mentioning any of them by their names, showed her that Frank must have kept silence on the subject of the engagement once existing between them. The confession of that vanished delusion was left for her to make, as part of the story of the past which she had pledged herself unreservedly to reveal. She wrote to Miss Garth, and sent the letter to the post immediately. The next morning brought a line of rejoinder. Miss Garth had written to secure the cottage at Shanklin, and Mr. Merrick had consented to Magdalen's removal on the following day. Norah would be the first to arrive at the house, and Miss Garth would follow, with a comfortable carriage to take the invalid to the railway. Every needful arrangement had been made for her. The effort of moving was the one effort she would have to make. Magdalen read the letter thankfully, but her thoughts wandered from it and followed Kirke on his return to the city. What was the business which had once already taken him there in the morning, and why had the promise exchanged between them obliged him to go to the city again, for the second time in one day? Was it, by any chance, business relating to the sea? Were his employers tempting him to go back to his ship? End of Chapter 3 of The Last Scene. The Last Scene, Aaron's Buildings, Chapter 4 of No Name. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bob Neufeld. No Name, by Wilkie Collins. The Last Scene, Aaron's Buildings, Chapter 4. The first agitation of the meeting between the sisters was over. The first vivid impressions, half pleasurable, half painful, had softened a little, and Norah and Magdalen sat together hand in hand, each wrapped in the silent fullness of her own joy. Magdalen was the first to speak. "You have something to tell me, Norah?" "I have 1,000 things to tell you, my love, and you have 10,000 things to tell me. Do you mean that second surprise which I told you of in my letter?" "Yes, I suppose it must concern me very nearly, or you would hardly have thought of mentioning it in your first letter." "It does concern you very nearly. You have heard of George's house in Essex. You must be familiar at least with the name of St. Crux. What is there to start at, my dear? I am afraid you are hardly strong enough for any more surprises just yet." "Quite strong enough, Norah. I have something to say to you about St. Crux. I have a surprise on my side for you. Will you tell it to me now?" "Not now. You shall know it when we are at the seaside. You shall know it before I accept the kindness which has invited me to your husband's house." "What can it be? Why not tell me at once?" "You used often to set me the example of patience, Norah, in old times. Will you set me the example now?" "With all my heart." "Shall I return to my own story as well?" "Yes." "Then we will go back to it at once. I was telling you that St. Crux is George's house in Essex, the house he inherited from his uncle. Knowing that Miss Garth had a curiosity to see the place, he left word, when he went abroad after the Admiral's death, that she and any friends who came with her were to be admitted, if she happened to find herself in the neighborhood during his absence. Miss Garth and I, and a large party of Mr. Tyrrel's friends, found ourselves in the neighborhood not long after George's departure. We had all been invited to see the launch of Mr. Tyrrel's new yacht from the builder's yard at Wivenhoe in Essex. When the launch was over, the rest of the company returned to Colchester to dine. Miss Garth and I contrived to get into the same carriage together, with nobody but my 2 little pupils for our companions. We gave the coachman his orders, and drove round by St. Crux. The moment Miss Garth mentioned her name, we were let in, and shown all over the house. I don't know how to describe it to you. It is the most bewildering place I ever saw in my life. Don't attempt to describe it, Norah. Go on with your story instead. Very well. My story takes me straight into one of the rooms at St. Crux, a room about as long as your street here, so dreary, so dirty, and so dreadfully cold, that I shiver at the bare recollection of it. Miss Garth was for getting out of it again as speedily as possible, and so was I, but the housekeeper declined to let us off without first looking at a singular piece of furniture, the only piece of furniture in the comfortless place. She called it a tripod, I think. There is nothing to be alarmed at, Magdalen. I assure you there is nothing to be alarmed at. At any rate, it was a strange 3-legged thing, which supported a great panful of charcoal ashes at the top. It was considered by all good judges, the housekeeper told us, a wonderful piece of chasing in metal, and she especially pointed out the beauty of some scroll-work running round the inside of the pan, with Latin mottoes on it, signifying I forget what. I felt not the slightest interest in the thing myself, but I looked close at the scroll-work to satisfy the housekeeper. To confess the truth, she was rather tiresome with her mechanically learned lecture on the fine metal-work, and while she was talking I found myself idly stirring the soft feathery white ashes backward and forward with my hand, pretending to listen, with my mind 100 miles away from her. I don't know how long or how short a time I had been playing with the ashes, when my fingers suddenly encountered a piece of crumpled paper, hidden deep among them. When I brought it to the surface, it proved to be a letter, a long letter full of cramped, close writing. You have anticipated my story, Magdalen, before I can end it. You know as well as I do that the letter which my idle fingers found was the secret trust. Hold out your hand, my dear. I have got George's permission to show it to you, and there it is." She put the trust into her sister's hand. Magdalen took it from her mechanically. "You!" she said, looking at her sister with the remembrance of all that she had vainly ventured, of all that she had vainly suffered at St. Crux. "You have found it." "Yes," said Norah gaily. "The trust has proved no exception to the general perversity of all lost things. Look for them, and they remain invisible. Leave them alone, and they reveal themselves. You and your lawyer, Magdalen, were both justified in supposing that your interest in this discovery was an interest of no common kind. I spare you all our consultations after I had produced the crumpled paper from the ashes. It ended in George's lawyer being written to, and in George himself being recalled from the Continent. Miss Garth and I both saw him immediately on his return. He did what neither of us could do. He solved the mystery of the trust being hidden in the charcoal ashes. Admiral Bartram, you must know, was all his life subject to fits of somnambulism. He had been found walking in his sleep not long before his death, just at the time, too, when he was sadly troubled in his mind on the subject of that very letter in your hand. George's idea is that he must have fancied he was doing in his sleep what he would have died rather than do in his waking moments, destroying the trust. The fire had been lighted in the pan not long before, and he no doubt saw it still burning in his dream. This was George's explanation of the strange position of the letter when I discovered it. The question of what was to be done with the letter itself came next, and was no easy question for a woman to understand, but I determined to master it, and I did master it, because it related to you. "Let me try to master it in my turn," said Magdalen. "I have a particular reason for wishing to know as much about this letter as you know yourself. What has it done for others, and what is it to do for me?" "My dear Magdalen, how strangely you look at it! How strangely you talk of it! Worthless as it may appear, that morsel of paper gives you A fortune. Is my only claim to the fortune the claim which this letter gives me? Yes, the letter is your only claim. Shall I try if I can explain it in 2 words? Taken by itself, the letter might, in the lawyer's opinion, have been made a matter for dispute, though I am sure George would have sanctioned no proceeding of that sort. Taken, however, with the postscript which Admiral Bartram attached to it, you will see the lines if you look under the signature on the 3rd page. It becomes legally binding, as well as morally binding, on the Admiral's representatives. I have exhausted my small stock of legal words, and must go on in my own language instead of in the lawyer's. The end of the thing was simply this. All the money went back to Mr. Noel Vanstone's estate. Another legal word. My vocabulary is richer than I thought. For one plain reason, that it had not been employed as Mr. Noel Vanstone directed. If Mrs. Girdlestone had lived, or if George had married me a few months earlier, results would have been just the other way. As it is, half the money has been already divided between Mr. Noel Vanstone's next of kin, which means, translated into plain English, my husband and his poor bedridden sister, who took the money formally one day to satisfy the lawyer, and gave it back again generously the next to satisfy herself. So much for one half of this legacy. The other half, my dear, is all yours. How strangely events happen, Magdalen! It is only 2 years since you and I were left disinherited orphans, and we are sharing our poor father's fortune between us, after all. Wait a little, Norah. Our shares come to us in very different ways. Do they? Mine comes to me by my husband. Yours comes to you—" She stopped confusedly and changed colour. "Forgive me, my own love," she said, putting Magdalen's hand to her lips. "I have forgotten what I ought to have remembered. I have thoughtlessly distressed you." "No," said Magdalen. "You have encouraged me." "Encouraged you?" "You shall see." With these words she rose quietly from the sofa and walked to the open window. Before Norah could follow her, she had torn the truss to pieces and had cast the fragments into the street. She came back to the sofa and laid her head, with a deep sigh of relief, on Norah's bosom. "I will owe nothing to my past life," she said. "I have parted with it as I have parted with these torn morsels of paper. All the thoughts and all the hopes belonging to it are put away from me forever. Magdalen, my husband will never allow you. I will never allow you myself. Hush, hush. What your husband thinks right, Norah, you and I will think right too. I will take from you what I would never have taken if that letter had given it to me. Nothing is changed but the position I once thought we might hold toward each other. Better as it is, my love. Far, far better as it is." So she made the last sacrifice of the old perversity and the old pride. So she entered on the new and nobler life. A month had passed. The autumn sunshine was bright, even in the murky streets, and the clocks in the neighbourhood were just striking 2 as Magdalen returned alone to the house in Erin's Buildings. "Is he waiting for me?" she asked, anxiously, when the landlady let her in. He was waiting in the front room. Magdalen stole up the stairs and knocked at the door. He called to her carelessly and absently to come in, plainly thinking that it was only the servant who applied for permission to enter the room. "You hardly expected me so soon?" she said, speaking on the threshold, and pausing there to enjoy his surprise as he started to his feet and looked at her. The only traces of illness still visible in her face left a delicacy in its outline which added refinement to her beauty. She was simply dressed in muslin. Her plain straw bonnet had no other ornament than the white ribbon with which it was sparingly trimmed. She had never looked lovelier in her best days than she looked now, as she advanced to the table at which he had been sitting, with a little basket of flowers that she had brought with her from the country, and offered him her hand. He looked anxious and careworn when she saw him closer. She interrupted his first inquiries and congratulations to ask if he had remained in London since they had parted, if he had not even gone away for a few days only to see his friends in Suffolk. No, he had been in London ever since. He never told her that the pretty parsonage house in Suffolk wanted all those associations with herself in which the poor 4 walls at Aaron's Buildings were so rich. He only said he had been in London ever since. "I wonder," she asked, looking him attentively in the face, "if you are as happy to see me again as I am to see you." "Perhaps I am even happier, in my different way," he answered, with a smile. She took off her bonnet and scarf, and seated herself once more in her own arm-chair. "I suppose this street is very ugly," she said, "and I am sure nobody can deny that the house is very small. And yet it feels like coming home again. Sit there where you used to sit. Tell me all about yourself. I want to know all that you have done, all that you have thought even, while I have been away." She tried to resume the endless succession of questions by means of which she was accustomed to lure him into speaking of himself, but she put them far less spontaneously, far less adroitly than usual. Her one all-absorbing anxiety in entering that room was not an anxiety to be trifled with. After a quarter of an hour wasted in constrained inquiries on one side, in reluctant replies on the other, she ventured near the dangerous subject at last. "Have you received the letters I wrote to you from the seaside?" she asked, suddenly looking away from him for the first time. "Yes," he said, "all." "Have you read them?" "Every one of them, many times over." Her heart beat as if it would suffocate her. She had kept her promise bravely. The whole story of her life, from the time of the home wreck at Combe-Raven to the time when she had destroyed the secret trust in her sister's presence, had been all laid before him. Nothing that she had done, nothing even that she had thought, had been concealed from his knowledge. As he would have kept a pledged engagement with her, so she had kept her pledged engagement with him. She had not faltered in the resolution to do this. And now she faltered over the one decisive question which she had come there to ask. Strong as the desire in her was to know if she had lost or won him, the fear of knowing was at that moment stronger still. She waited and trembled. She waited and said no more. "May I speak to you about your letters?" he asked. "May I tell you—" If she had looked at him as he said those few words, she would have seen what he thought of her in his face. She would have seen, innocent as he was in this world's knowledge, that he knew the priceless value, the all-ennobling virtue of a woman who speaks the truth. But she had no courage to look at him, no courage to raise her eyes from her lap. "Not just yet," she said faintly. "Not quite so soon after we have met again." She rose hurriedly from her chair and walked to the window, turned back again into the room, and approached the table close to where he was sitting. The writing materials scattered near him offered her a pretext for changing the subject, and she seized on it directly. "Were you writing a letter," she asked, "when I came in?" "I was thinking about it," he replied. "It was not a letter to be written without thinking first." He rose as he answered her to gather the writing materials together and put them away. "Why should I interrupt you?" she said. "Why not let me try whether I can't help you instead? Is it a secret?" "No, not a secret." He hesitated as he answered her. She instantly guessed the truth. "Is it about your ship?" He little knew how she had been thinking in her absence from him of the business which he believed that he had concealed from her. He little knew that she had learned already to be jealous of his ship. "Do they want you to return to your old life?" she went on. "Do they want you to go back to the sea? Must you say yes or no at once?" "At once." "If I had not come in when I did, would you have said yes?" She unconsciously laid her hand on his arm, forgetting all inferior considerations in her breathless anxiety to hear his next words. The confession of his love was within a hairbreadth of escaping him, but he checked the utterance of it even yet. "I don't care for myself," he thought, "but how can I be certain of not distressing her?" "Would you have said yes?" she repeated. "I was doubting," he answered. "I was doubting between yes and no." Her hand tightened on his arm. A sudden trembling seized her in every limb. She could bear it no longer. All her heart went out to him in her next words. "Were you doubting for my sake?" "Yes," he said. "Take my confession in return for yours. I was doubting for your sake." She said no more. She only looked at him. In that look the truth reached him at last. The next instant she was folded in his arms, and was shedding delicious tears of joy with her face hidden on his bosom. "Do I deserve my happiness?" she murmured, asking the one question at last. "Oh, I know how the poor narrow people who have never felt and never suffered would answer me if I asked them what I ask you. If they knew my story, they would forget all the provocation, and only remember the offence. They would fasten on my sin, and pass all my suffering by. But you are not one of them. Tell me if you have any shadow of a misgiving. Tell me if you would doubt that the one dear object of all my life to come is to live worthy of you. I asked you to wait and see me. I asked you, if there was any hard truth to be told, to tell it to me here, with your own lips. Tell it, my love, my husband. Tell it to me now." She looked up, still clinging to him as she clung to the hope for her better life to come. "Tell me the truth," she repeated. "With my own lips." "Yes," she answered eagerly. "Say what you think of me with your own lips." He stooped and kissed her. End of Chapter 4 of The Last Scene. End of the last scene. End of No Name by Wilkie Collins.